Thank you, Will. Thank you very much indeed, General. It's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to you this evening. Is that working all right at the back? Good. A great pleasure to have a chance to speak to you this evening. I first came across the Society of Army Historical Research, I don't know, about 12 or 13 years ago, I suppose. I was trying to do some research into Sir John Moore and the Battle of Corunna, and started digging around in back issues of the journal and was blown away by the erudition and scholarship of the membership of this society. So it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to you, and also to bring you together in the National Army Museum. I know that I'm on the council, one of the trustees effectively of the National Army Museum, and I know that the council and the director are extremely keen that this museum be seen as the academic, intellectual heart, if you like, of our army. And so to bring organisations like this into the museum, and for them to find a natural home here, I suppose, it is a great pleasure for all of us. 1918, greatest battles fought on the Western Front, battles which certainly concluded and possibly decided the course of the First World War, and yet I think, perhaps outside this room anyway, they remain pretty poorly understood. I think if you asked most people to nominate the year that they think was the most successful in the history of the British Army, very few would nominate 1918. And yet I think one can argue that never before or since has the Army exercised such strategic weight and done such an outstanding job of advancing Great Britain's foreign policy as during 1918. It helped to defeat the Central Powers, which of course ended the First World War. It guaranteed that Britain had a crucial seat at the Paris Peace Conference, and while it was doing both of those fairly important things, it was also safeguarding and indeed reinforcing Britain's imperial position all around the world. Today I'm not going to talk about the whole world, I'm just going to talk about the Western Front, and because that was where the Army, for the first and last time in its history, played a leading role in the defeat of the main enemy in the primary theatre of operations. It was British soldiers and airmen, together with their American, Belgian and French allies, who fought a series of battles throughout 1918, which together broke the spine of the German army, shattered the nerve of its leadership, and helped to force Germany to beg for peace. The map will be familiar to you all. But between March and November 1918, Sir Douglas Haig's British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, fought first of all in the spring a whole series of heavy German assaults to a standstill, and then during the late summer and autumn, alongside its allies, went on the offensive, overrunning multiple successive lines of defence and liberating swathes of Belgium and France, until the German High Command was left with no option but to request an armistice. And it's this latter campaign, the summer and autumn campaign, the so-called 100 Days campaign, that I'd like to talk about primarily today. Now, I suspect many of you know the story in detail, so I'll go through that fairly quickly and then spend perhaps a little bit more time talking about why things turned out the way that they did. The first sign, or a first sign, that the initiative on the Western Front was slipping out of the hands of the Germans and into those of the Allies came on Independence Day, the 4th of July 1918, when a mixed force of Australian and American troops conducted a small but perfectly designed attack using tanks, infantry, artillery and aircraft all working together to excellent effect to capture the village of Hamel. Here's a slightly romanticised version of it. They captured the village and over 1,000 German prisoners, all within 93 minutes. American troops played a major role too in inflicting a much more serious defeat on the Germans with a surprise counterattack alongside the French on the River Marne on the 18th of July. And that battle, the Second Battle of the Marne, marked the end of any attempt by the Germans to pursue offensive operations during the First World War. From now on, in contrast to the first half of the year, it would be the Americans, the Belgians, the British and the French who would be doing the attacking, while it would be the Germans who were desperately trying to hold on. The next large-scale Allied attack after the Second Battle of the Marne came on the 8th of August at Amiens, the map here on the right. And this was the battle which marked the beginning of the campaign, which soon became known as the 100 Days, with a conscious nod to Napoleon's 100 Days in 1815. Foch's overall intention, which he had outlined to Haig, to Pershing and to Pétain on the 24th of July, was, as a first step in the counter-offensive, to clear the Germans away from the lateral railway lines behind the Allied front, to free up Allied transportation all along the Western Front. And so the British Fourth Army, commanded by Sir Henry Rawlinson, was to start the process by pushing the Germans back east, away from the junction and the marshalling yards at and just east of Amiens. Meanwhile, the French First Army would liberate Montdidier. Amiens is just off the map to the west here. You can see the Roman road that goes west-east across the Amiens battlefield. If you've ever been to the Amiens battlefield, particularly with an unenthusiastic spouse, I have to say it's one of the most boring battlefields ever. It is almost billiard table flat. But anyway, my wife has never quite forgiven me. Rawlinson detailed the Australian, Canadian and British Third Corps to launch a surprise assault after no preliminary bombardment at 04:20 hours on the 8th of August. Some 3,500 British and French artillery pieces neutralised enemy guns, interdicted communications, targeted strong points and headquarters, and delivered a creeping barrage to cover the infantry advance. Nearly 2,000 Allied aircraft ensured air superiority and attacked ground targets, although their attempts to isolate the battlefield by blowing up the bridges over the Somme did not succeed. Over 500 tanks supported the infantry advance. Here's a, again, rather romanticised picture of troops moving up to the front in the Battle of Amiens. But you can see you've got artillery being pulled by the horses on the left, you've got tanks, you've got infantry, artillery shells obviously going off, and I can't see it. I don't think there's an aeroplane in the picture, unfortunately, but I'm sure they tried to fit one in. Now, at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, the BEF had learned that the same troops could not be relied upon to capture multiple objectives. They grew too tired and too disorganized. So this time, fresh troops leapfrogged through to maintain the momentum of the advance. And the first day of the attack at Amiens saw stunning success. Rawlinson's men advanced some 12 kilometers, capturing almost all their objectives and at least 12,000 German prisoners. Here are some of the German prisoners trudging back, and you can see the spire of Amiens Cathedral in the distance. Altogether, the Germans lost 27,000 men, and Ludendorff was so disgusted by the defenders' performance that he famously dubbed it the Black Day of the German army. Now, over the next few days of the battle, Allied momentum slowed, and the results dribbled away as resistance solidified and the familiar First World War entropy set in. So by the 11th of August, the British were exhausted and the offensive was suspended. And instead, the next army on Rawlinson's left, the British Third Army, on the north bank of the Somme and up towards Arras. So where are they? About, can't see from here. Oh, up here, beg your pardon. Yeah, up in this area. was warned to begin preparations to capture Bapaume, one of the objectives of the Somme offensive in 1916. Now, this decision to call a halt to Damiens on the 11th of August after just 4 days of fighting marked a significant shift of operational approach on the part of Haig and the BEF High Command, and it set a pattern for the rest of the war. From now on, the old bull-headed insistence on hammering away repeatedly at the same place with increasingly tired troops in the hope that the enemy might break was largely abandoned. Instead, each time that diminishing returns began to set in, the offensive was closed down and a new attack begun elsewhere. This was made possible by plentiful supplies and efficient transport, which also made possible coordinated operations on a scale and at a pace which had rarely been attempted before. Operations which had taken weeks or even months to prepare were conceived and launched in a matter of days, as Andy Simpson's book Directing Operations, sitting halfway back on my right-hand side, shows. The fighting of late August was very hard, however. Casualties were heavy and progress was very slow. It took 8 days to drive 7 miles and liberate the ruins of Bapaume, for instance. But by early September, the pressure was beginning to tell, and the German Army Group commander, Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, I promise that's the last time I shall mention him in this talk, had no choice but to order a retreat into the Hindenburg Line, giving up all the ground that had been gained since the 21st of March. So the northern half, more or less, of that red block there, Germans pulled back into the hard blue line, effectively. It took the Allies 3 weeks to close up to the Hindenburg Line, to clear the outworks and enemy salients, such as at Saint-Mihiel, and to prepare a set-piece assault as part of a plan drawn up by Foch for a series of coordinated offensives all the way from the River Meuse to the Channel. Between the 26th and the 29th of September, no fewer than 8 armies, well over 2 million men, from Belgium, France, Great Britain and the United States of America would seek to pose more problems than Ludendorff, the German commander, could ever solve, sucking in reserves here before striking there, breaking through the enemy defences and hopefully inflicting a victory that would win the war. The Americans, under Pershing, attacked on the 26th in the Argonne. The next day, the British followed up on the 27th with an audacious combat crossing of the Canal du Nord by 3rd Army and 1st Army, and clearing the Hindenburg Line, moving towards Cambrai. On the 28th, British, Belgian and French troops attacked around Ypres. In 48 hours, they captured all the ground that the BEF had bled for 4 months to capture in the course of the previous year. And it was only when the weather broke in Flanders and logistics broke down that the advance in the north stalled. And then on the 29th, Rawlinson's 4th Army attacked again around, well, I'm going to call it St. Quentin. I know that's not how you're supposed to pronounce it, but if you'll excuse me, I'm going to be English about it. They seized crossings over the Saint-Quentin Canal, broke into the Hindenburg Line in what has been described as one of the greatest feats of British military history. Now, once again, in this fighting in the Hindenburg Line, German resistance was ferocious, but the Allies slowly chewed through it. And by the 8th of October, at least in the north of the Western Front, they had everywhere broken through into open territory where the Germans had no prepared defences left, or very few. Further south, however, US troops were finding the going very hard in the Meuse-Argonne, and logistics now began to make their weight felt, as the difficulty of rebuilding rails, roads and bridges made it increasingly difficult to bring up the heavy guns and tanks that were needed for set-piece assaults. To give you some idea of the scale of the logistic task, in the 10 départements of France that were fought over during the First World War, when they came to reconstruct, they had to rebuild half of all the roads and rebuild 600 bridges. And obviously the combat engineers were trying to do that as they went forwards in the course of the advance. The most important consequence of the battles on the Hindenburg Line, however, was that together with the actual, or obviously imminent, collapse of all Germany's allies, they broke the spirit of the German High Command. On the 28th of September, Hindenburg and Ludendorff conferred and agreed that they needed an immediate armistice. Otherwise, the army might disintegrate and might not be available if what was now their number one fear, Bolshevik revolution at home, came about. The Kaiser appointed a new government which asked President Wilson for peace talks on the 5th of October. Now, proper negotiations didn't really start for some time yet, but for the first time an end to the war seemed to be a possibility. I'll come back and talk a little bit about the effect that the announcement that peace talks had begun, had on combat motivation a little bit later. But the fighting remained extremely heavy, particularly as, especially in the area east of Cambrai and up around Lille, the terrain was much more enclosed again, more mining towns, mining villages, very heavily built up after the downland of the Somme battles. Casualties remained very, very heavy. Oops, it's not quite what I was expecting. Here we are. So this is a map drawn by Barbara, I think. Yes, a lovely map then. Of the 100 Days offensive. You can see starting from this dotted blue line all the way, this is the finish line in November. By early November, the British had fought their way across the rivers Lys and Selle. They had liberated Lille, Ghent and Valenciennes, and were preparing another deliberate attack on German positions behind the river Sambre. When they launched this on the 4th of November, the result was resounding victory. The Germans began a headlong retreat, covered by skillful rear guards, which delayed the British so well that by the 8th of November the two sides had completely lost touch. By the morning of the 11th of November, when news of the armistice arrived, Canadian troops were famously in Mons, back where the BEF's war had begun. So much for what happened. Oh, there's an accident. What I'd like to do now is come on and talk a little bit about why all this happened the way it did. The way that military historians have tended to explain Allied and especially British success during the 100 Days has tended, I think, to be rather hindsight heavy. Because they've been searching for its impact on the development of modern war and looking for the roots of blitzkrieg, they have tended to flatten out the history a little bit, I think, to smooth out some of the nuance and to downplay some of the contingency that took place, or that was important, in 1918. British and Commonwealth historians in particular, keen to react against the long-running and popular lions led by donkeys myth, have highlighted how much the BEF learnt as the war went on. And the story they tell is something along these lines. In 1915 and 1916, the army was forced to expand too fast on too narrow a base of experience and to adapt to new ways of war, all the time struggling against a ferocious and highly dangerous enemy, as well as against shortages of trained troops and of materiel. By 1918, however, they argue, it had become the equal to, or even superior to, the best continental militaries. These historians have placed particular emphasis on the BEF's tactical development, stressing the integration of new weapons such as the aeroplane, tank and poison gas, together with the adoption of innovative ways of using traditional ones, such as artillery, trench mortars and infantry, weaving the whole into a combined arms weapons system capable of overcoming any defence that the Germans were capable of mounting. At the operational level, not only had the BEF learnt lessons about the importance of breaking off offensives before they reached culmination point, as the technical term, i.e. when they start to run out of gas, and about exploiting laterally, using the width of the front rather than exploiting vertically in depth, as we've already seen, but British command had, we are told, been made considerably more flexible. In place of the unwieldy top-down restrictive control, is the phrase that Martin Samuels uses, management style of the war's middle years, an approach closer to modern ideas of mission command was adopted, with authority delegated and more latitude given to the man on the spot to exercise his initiative according to the situation as he interpreted it. This improved response times and led to better decision making in the more freewheeling, semi-mobile warfare which characterized the 100 Days. There is much truth to this picture. The British Army of 1918 was a much more capable instrument than it had been even a year earlier, never mind on the first day of the Somme, say, despite the inevitable and ongoing heavy casualties it had suffered in the interim. If manpower was running low, however, firepower was plentiful. Just to give you one example, the weight of shells fired off by British artillery during the week of the attacks on the Hindenburg Line in 1918 was 3 times what had been possible on the Somme 2 years previously. More to the point, the Allies knew what to do with the weapons that they had. There is no question that often after a process of trial and error, the British Army had ascended a range of individual, here comes the phrase for those who've been waiting for it, learning curves, and developed experience and new skills. By the summer of 1918, for instance, the RAF had discovered and were executing all the principal roles for aviation in war that have been used forever since. And just to give you one example, to fire an artillery shell with the increased accuracy that was possible by 1918 depended on improved techniques and new inventions in a range of fields which included, this is not an exhaustive list, survey, aerial photography, meteorology, metallurgy, fusion propellant technology, communications, command, control, and intelligence. To then employ that shell to the best possible effect required a sophisticated grasp of tactics and of operational art. And nothing was possible at all without mastery of the logistic skills necessary to transport the shell to the gun and to ensure that the gun was working with the crew fed, clothed, watered, and ready to fire. This was a complex operation. A lot of things had to all come together at once. The army had learnt not only how to fight, but also how to learn. I know that many of you, I hope, will have had the chance to hear Amy Fox, winner of your Best First Book Prize this year, talk on this subject. In that book, she shows, I think, very well that consciously, or by fortunate accident perhaps, the army managed to construct a highly flexible and effective system of learning systems, operating simultaneously down multiple different channels, each characterized by varying degrees of formality and central control, to spread the word and to ensure that innovation and adaptation was as effective and efficient as possible. To see how much more potent the British Army was as a weapon by the end of 1918, all we really need to do is to compare the BEF's position at the beginning and the end of the year. In January and February, frankly, it had squatted on the defensive, apparently paralysed by a high command reshuffle and by a swinging reorganisation of its ranks, awaiting a German offensive which it knew was coming, expected to be able to contain, but had no thought of preempting or of any way trying to disrupt. By the end of the year, in contrast, the BEF had launched multiple major offensives, employing at times up to 5 armies at once, in less time than it had taken to plan a single attack by just one army in 1916, and had defeated the German army time and again, outfighting it both in trench warfare and in more mobile operations. And all of this had been achieved while continually advancing, as Haig and Foch employed with great success, a form of rolling attrition designed to chew through German reserves of manpower while slowly and continually forcing them back. The logistic achievement was no less important, no less impressive than the fighting performance. The BEF, in sum, had played a leading role in defeating the most feared army in the world, the military which had set the standard worldwide for half a century. Now, this central and important fact of British improvement should not, I think, blind us to two other realities, however. First, the German army of late 1918 was a much weaker opponent than it had been earlier in the war, largely, in fairness, as a result of the attrition imposed by the British and the French in the war's middle years. And secondly, while the improvement in the British army was considerable, it would be a mistake to regard the BEF as some kind of paragon of military virtue, which had unlocked the secret of success in modern war, and then applied the recipe consistently throughout the 100 Days. Indeed, its victory was founded, at least as much on mobilizing its traditional values and ethos as on new conceptual insights and ways of war. And I'd like to take these two different issues in turn, and perhaps start with the Germans. Now, between the wars, German military writers, especially those who were working on the official history at the Reichsarchiv in Potsdam, tended to ascribe the failures of 1918 to one of three causes. The first, which was popular on the right, and especially among the Nazis, was the toxic lie that the German army had never been defeated, but had been stabbed in the back by Bolsheviks and Jews on the home front. This is demonstrably false as history. It's a political myth rather than the military explanation, and consequently I intend to pay it no further attention. The second line of criticism of what went on in 1918 was Ludendorff's generalship and decisions. They accused him both of butchering the execution of the spring offensives and of holding too far forwards for too long in the summer, when they say he should have pulled back sooner into more defensible positions. Now, there's no question that Ludendorff's leadership was erratic throughout 1918. As he became more and more frustrated at the deteriorating situation, he tried to micromanage increasing amounts of the war all on his own, all the way down to dictating the deployment of individual anti-tank gun batteries at times. This from a man who was also responsible for the overall coordination of the whole German war effort from Belgium to Baku in Azerbaijan. It was madness. No man could hope to do this, and also to maintain sight of the bigger picture. And by September, exhaustion contributed to some kind of breakdown for Ludendorff, famously, the symptoms of which were only alleviated by a regime prescribed for him by his doctors of smelling roses and singing patriotic songs. He was definitely not the general that Germany needed in the crisis of 1918, but I suspect that her position had deteriorated so far by then, both politically and militarily, that it's doubtful that anyone else could have done much better. The third explanation for collapse, particularly popular in the 1920s and 1930s, was that especially from 1916 onward, the German army was ground down by Allied material superiority rather than fighting skill, to the point where it lost touch with its old high professional standards and became little more than a half-trained citizen militia. Consequently, both its skill and morale suffered, leaving it vulnerable to the ever-growing enemy advantages in manpower and in kit. Now, there's no question that the German army of 1918 was without doubt a weaker force than it had been in 1914 or in 1916. And it certainly did lag the Allies in increasingly important materiel. Just to give you some examples, by the summer of 1918 it was outnumbered 2-to-1 in aircraft, 6-to-1 in tanks, and 10-to-1 in lorries. And manpower was also a concern. Germany had been at war by then for 3.5 years, and 1.75 million of her soldiers had died, with obviously many more seriously wounded as well. The only way to keep the ranks even relatively full was by drafting in young men who often proved less resilient and morale became more fragile. The most serious problems, I would argue, that confronted the Germans in 1918, however, did not concern materiel or manpower or even morale, but the army's very ability to think. It had lost its ability to adapt to the changing situations in which it found itself. An organization which had always prided itself on its flexibility of command became increasingly arthritic. As the problems confronting it multiplied and intensified, ideas of delegated command, Auftragstaktik is the German phrase, with the subordinate on the spot encouraged to exercise his initiative within the framework of his superior's intent, evaporated. Ludendorff himself set the tone with his micromanagement. He was quick to blame and slow to praise, and treated his subordinates with increasing disdain and aggression. The insecurity that Ludendorff felt about his position, dependent as he was on the goodwill of a very flaky Kaiser, must have been a little bit like working for Donald Trump, transmitted itself down through the ranks of command and spread fear through a structure that was already inherently unstable. And the consequence, inevitably, was that too often, after-action reports told the boss what he wanted, not what he needed to hear, especially when that boss was Erich Ludendorff. Inconvenient truths remained untold, objectivity fell away, and decisions became made on the basis of increasingly flawed information. Ludendorff continued almost to the last to tinker with his men's defensive tactics in the belief that the problem lay there. But this tactical obsession, and it wasn't just Ludendorff's in fairness, meant that the Germans missed 3 salient facts. First, that actually they had already been defeated at the political and strategic levels of war. Secondly, that their immediate problem was not a tactical one, it was the operational one of matching Allied tempo and resources. And thirdly, that British tactical improvement had shifted the battlefield terms of trade, as it were, against the German troops, such that more was required than just ironing out their own mistakes. When the disease was being misdiagnosed so badly, there was little chance of a cure. So much for the Germans. Coming on to the British now, well, a good example of the BEF's tactical improvement was in the realm of combined arms. I've already hinted at this several times. The way that it integrated armour, artillery, aviation, infantry, and even on occasion cavalry could be devastating, as, for instance, the first day of the Battle of Amiens demonstrated. Rarely, however, were the British able so effectively to draw on their whole panoply at once in this way. Amiens was an exception, not the rule. Whatever the reality of British combined arms tactics, however, the threat of them, and in particular the threat posed by tanks, undoubtedly destabilized the German defense. Tanks were neither in fact nor potentially the war-winning weapon that apostles of armour such as JFC Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart claimed between the wars. But neither were they an irrelevance, as some, such as the British official historian James Edmonds, have claimed. Because tanks posed 2 particular threats to the Germans. First, they could cut barbed wire for the infantry, a job that the artillery had previously had to do. That removed the need for a preparatory bombardment, and so it reintroduced the possibility of surprise. Secondly, the mobile firepower that tanks offered and the moral impact that they had on defending infantry could help the attacker break through relatively quickly and gave him the chance of overrunning the German artillery positions, which was the key to any First World War battle. There was a solution to both these problems, however, and the Germans were quick to find it. Because the most effective way to knock out enemy tanks was to position field guns in forward positions where they could engage them over open sights by direct fire. And by mid-September, at least a third of German field artillery was deployed forward in this way. And it was extremely successful in inflicting heavy losses on British armoured units, to the point that which was a factor, at least, in a marked decline in British use of armour from the middle of October 1918 onwards. The proximity of anti-tank guns also stiffened the morale of the infantry in the front line and reduced tank panic, so-called. However, solving one problem, as so often on any battlefield, and perhaps particularly on the First World War battlefield, merely created others. Because these guns that had been detached to the front were now very vulnerable to being overrun by infantry assault, especially when visibility was poor. And of course, autumn, early morning, northwest Europe, lots of fog. Losses of artillery were consequently very high. The other problem was that the guns that were left to the rear were not only fewer in number than they might otherwise have been, but were often deployed further back to reduce the risk of them being overrun by tanks. So inevitably, the artillery could not deliver the same weight of indirect fire support to defending infantry, weakening the defensive barrage, leaving the infantry feeling abandoned, and undermining their morale in a different way than the tanks had done. The failure of the German army to identify and alter its tactics to reflect the declining British armour threat from October onwards, I think, is an excellent example of the rigidity of its responses by this stage of the war. Now, it's important to remember that the German army did not spontaneously lose the ability to think straight in 1918. The main cause of its cognitive breakdown was enemy pressure. The speed and violence of the Allied offensives exhausted not only the material and moral, but also the mental capacity of the German army to react, and exposed its underlying weaknesses. Its rigid and over-centralized response stands in contrast to the flexibility demonstrated by the BEF. The German command structure tended to ossify further with every setback, while the British one became more relaxed as confidence grew they were on the right track. And this is clearest in British attempts to decentralize decision-making in an attempt to improve reaction times and increase tempo. Having passed through a phase of centralized restrictive command in the structured and carefully choreographed set-piece battles of 1916-17, the BEF in 1918 began to move to delegate more authority, allowing the man on the spot the maximum possible initiative. This did not always work. Many commanders at all levels found it hard to adjust to the looser command arrangements that semi-mobile warfare demanded of them. Some inevitably, who'd grown habituated to receiving or issuing dozens of pages of neatly typed instructions, never grew comfortable with quick verbal briefings later corroborated by a few paragraphs scribbled in pencil on a couple of pages torn out of a notebook. Senior commanders also proved as reluctant to relinquish control as junior ones were to assume responsibility. Nevertheless, overall, greater delegation was one factor underpinning a tempo of operations much faster than anything previously achieved on the Western Front. This delegation was partly the result, and indeed this higher tempo, was partly the result of a higher level of expertise throughout the whole BEF. As Robin Pryor and Trevor Wilson argued in their seminal work on Sir Henry Rawlinson, the importance of higher command tended to wither away. But it was as much a reassertion of traditional values as a reaction to new realities. Because at work was the British Army's pre-war principle of letting the man on the spot get on with it. Active service all over the globe, frequently dispersed in small units with very poor or non-existent communications, had always placed a premium on initiative in the Victorian and Edwardian army, and reinforced an even older tradition of gentlemanly independence which dated back far into the army's history. Officers were expected, as gentlemen, to do the right thing without having to be told. Now, such expectations were perhaps unrealistic with the inexperienced men of 1915-16 and in the circumstances of 1915-16. In any case, the intricate choreography of the set-piece trench battles of the war's middle years militated against allowing individuals much leeway. But as the fighting lost structure in 1918, tried and tested commanders were once more, within limits, accorded some of the autonomy that their predecessors had been used to on the frontiers of empire. The traditional ethos of the British Army reasserted itself in another important manner, I would argue, and that is its approach to learning and adaptation. We saw above that the BEF had got better at fighting and learning by 1918, but that it did not always either fully internalize or implement the lessons that it had learnt. The efficiency with which information was disseminated around the organization varied widely, and some units seem to have been unable to process new information sufficiently well to change their approach. It is certainly possible to see the British Army of 1914-18 as a very imperfect learning organization, incapable of generating change in any uniform, systematic fashion. The British certainly, at first sight at least, look haphazard next to the French and especially the German armies, both of which employed a more centralized process within which the centre played a much more active role in promoting adaptation. The British Army, however, had a long tradition of laissez-faire, of leaving as much latitude as possible to commanding officers to train the men that they would lead, whom they would lead into action, rather than by imposing centrally devised programs. And British officers, as David French has pointed out, also tended to perceive themselves as pragmatists and skilled improvisers with a distaste for theory which set them apart from their continental counterparts. The point I'm making, or trying to make, is that the British Army of the First World War was very successful in its change because it was working with the cultural grain of the organization rather than across it. And so if we compare it with the French or the Germans or indeed the modern American army, and I suppose this is really where I'm coming back to, and we say that it looks inefficient at learning, well, that's because we're applying the wrong model. We're not thinking about the culture of the army at the time. We're using a NATO standard, if you like, for an army that was operating in an entirely different kind of a way. There's also a direct effect on the First World War battlefield, which was that the British, as a result of this sort of laissez-faire attitude, the British were sometimes unpredictable as an opponent. The Germans, on the other hand, could be extremely predictable, and the Allies and the British certainly exploited that. So the Allies in 1918 were able to combine, this is just to conclude, were able to combine modern techniques with traditional values and strengths to very good effect, and a range of factors underpinned success. Mistakes and institutional weaknesses of the German army played a part to an extent that I think historians have tended to underestimate. And this has led in turn to an overestimation of the Allied and especially the British Army's capabilities by this stage of the war. I hope I have demonstrated today that the British Army of 1918 was far from a new model army of uniform excellence. Mainly citizen soldiers serving only for the duration, however, many had become skilled warriors, or more adept at the highly technological new ways of fighting than their enemies. Others, inevitably, lacked the experience or the training to reach the same level. The peaks of performance were high, the troughs depressingly familiar. By the end of the year 1918, however, the profit and loss ledger for the BEF contained more pluses than minuses, and that at the end of the day was all that mattered. They only had to be good enough. Success was built on a mix of new sciences and old arts. Modern machines and techniques, married to old-fashioned virtues such as leadership and courage, delivered victory in the most terrible war to date. Thank you very much indeed.